When Sony was giving me the rundown on the new 50mm 1.4G Master, my initial thought was, why? We already have like 4 other 50mm 1.4 lenses for Sony E-mount, including the new Sigma 51.4 and one of the best G Master lenses that I have ever used, the 50mm 1.2, which is already extremely compact for having such a wide aperture. At the same time, I get it. Sony hasn't announced a native 51.4 for their mirrorless line since the OG Sony Zeiss version that launched 7 years ago. And to be fair here, this 50mm would have probably made a bigger splash, you know, in my mind at least, if the Sigma didn't launch only weeks prior. And now this leads me to another thought that I was having. Now, looking at it from the other side, from a business perspective, I can imagine a scenario like this one right here being a part of the reason why Canon said to hell with third-party manufacturers. But again, that's just me thinking out loud. When testing out the image quality of the 51.4, it's what you would expect it to be. It's near clinically perfect, just like most modern lenses. For a point of comparison, I compared it to the 51.2 G Master. I know this lens is more expensive, but I feel like it's more expensive because, you know, it has an f1.2 aperture, but both of these lenses are relatively new in design and they have all the latest coatings and technology that any new G Master lens has. So when comparing it to the 51.2, I found that the 51.4 is just as sharp, like tack razor sharp, and is very, very similar to the 51.2 at f1.2, which in my opinion, I think that's actually that's kind of a flex on the 51.2 to be able to be that sharp at that super wide aperture, the same as the 51.4 at 1.4. So that's a little flex on the 51.2, but this is not what we're talking about today. I thought the results looked really good. When comparing the 51.4 with the 1.2 within a backlit situation, you are getting better flaring control on the 51.4. When it comes to chromatic aberration, the 51.4 does an incredible job of controlling it. Same goes for the 1.2. Also, just like the OG Sony Zeiss 51.4, this one has 11 aperture blades, just like the 51.2 has, and also like the Sigma 51.4. So obviously it's not a challenge to put 11 aperture blades in a lens design like this. And so comparing it again to the 51.2, comparing the bokeh, it's very comparable. The only difference I noticed is that when I stopped down to f1.2 on this baby, you did notice a difference. You notice a difference in the amount of blur that you get from a 1.2 to 1.4 at 50mm. It was actually more than I thought it would be, but the quality is there. Really nice, smooth background blur. No complaints there. So now, what about autofocusing? So for photos, it's damn near instantaneous. The moment you have pressed that shutter, it just locks on. And even if you're close focusing and you go to infinity, again, it's damn near instantaneous. Compared to the 51.2, the 51.2 is actually, like, splitting hairs here, it's actually a tiny bit faster than the 51.4, which is interesting because this has more stuff to move around inside, but no complaints at all. And I was shooting in the studio with the 51.4, and sometimes, you know, the lighting wasn't good when she was in and out of the slit. You know, it kept up with her really well, and I was shooting everything at f1.4, and I have zero complaints about it in photo mode. And now for video, I found it to be just like any other Sony native lens. It's very accurate, very responsive, especially when you're doing touch tracking. Compared to the 51.2, I didn't notice many differences, man. If you plan on using the 51.4 G Master for video, you're in for a little treat here, okay? Because focusing, breathing, both of these lenses suck at it, okay? So the 51.2 is actually notorious for its terrible focusing, breathing. I mean, there's a compromise to making a lens this small, but thankfully, using software focusing, breathing compensation like the A7R5 and a couple of other newer cameras have, it corrects that in camera, which is amazing. But a lot of video-centric cameras like the A7S III, FX3A1, for example, should have it, but don't have focusing, breathing compensation. And this is where it gets a little tricky because the 51.4 also suffers from terrible focusing, breathing. And comparing them side by side, I would say the 1.2 is a little bit worse with focusing, breathing than the 1.4. They're both terrible. But once you put focusing, breathing compensation on, in my Sony A7R5, they both perform beautifully. So that's just something that you need to be aware of. And again, I'm trying to push Sony to include a firmware update every time I talk about this stuff. Into A7S III should have it, FX3 should have it, A1 should have it. So now what about lens design? And this 51.4 adds a feature that I wish my 51.2 had, and that is an iris lock, because I'm constantly bumping this aperture ring, whether it's in the bag, taking it out, or just picking it up by the lens, constantly moving that. It's going to some random aperture. So it does have an iris lock button, which I love. It has the same, focus hold button as the 51.2, has 2 focus hold buttons, has an AF/MF switch. You have a click on and off for your aperture ring. I do know off the top of my head that this lens weighs around 1.14 pounds. That's the conversion of 516 grams. So it is very lightweight and very portable. And that's one of the biggest reasons to choose a lens like this over, let's say, the 51.2. This lens has 14 elements and 11 groups. It has 2 XA extreme spherical lens elements. Has 1 ED glass element. It has 11 blade aperture, I already mentioned that. And it has a nano AR2 coating, which is to control flaring. And I mentioned this earlier, but looking at the flaring with the lens, with light coming directly in, it does have an advantage over the f1.2. And I don't know if that has anything to do with the coating or just the way the lens, the way the lens is designed inside. It does control flaring very, very well. Very good, very good. So who should buy this lens? Well, Sony gave me an unofficial price of $1,200 to $1,500 for this lens. The Sigma at $850 makes more sense for photographers, but for video, you don't get access to focus breathing compensation and is worth paying more in my opinion. But of course, that's assuming that you have a camera that has access to that feature. Your size and weight are not your top priority. I would save up a little more and still get that 51.2 G Master.